I am an engineer with the National Fire Protection Association. Before I go on any further, I just want to ask, how many of you guys have heard of the National Fire Protection Association? Okay, good. I just want to make sure before I go on and you guys don't know exactly what we do. But for some of those who maybe not have raised your hands, we are a self-funded nonprofit organization that's been around since 1896. We're an information and knowledge organization. We deliver our information and knowledge through our over 300 consensus standards and codes. Today I'm going to be talking to you guys about one of our standards, which has actually now just become a standard, NFPA 3, which is the standard for commissioning of fire protection and life safety systems. How many of you guys have heard of NFPA 3, have heard of this standard? Okay, good. How many of you guys have looked through it, read through any of the requirements? Okay. How many of you guys have worked on a project with fire protection systems being commissioned as part of that project? Okay, good amount. One thing you're going to notice, and a common theme that I've been seeing doing a lot of work with this project and the integrated system testing, is within fire protection and life safety, they're starting to realize that this is a big need. Commissioning and integrated system testing for fire protection and life safety systems, due to the complexity of these systems, is starting to become something that is, everyone's looking at it and realizing that they need to do it, and that's why you're going to start to see it come into building codes as requirements. There's not a lot in this standard. It's actually only 6 pages of this document are enforceable language. The rest is just explanatory material. So if you ever did want to look through it, it's not a whole lot to look through. It's mostly a document that's going through. It's not prescriptive. It's more performance-based. It's telling you how you should do it, what things you need to be doing during the process. But because of that, it allows you to apply it to multiple different projects. And I'll talk about that coming up. And sort of the best way for me to explain it to you guys is to kind of talk about how NFPA 3 defines the commissioning process. One thing you're going to notice is it's going to sound very familiar, but there are going to be some things that are slightly different. But the important thing is that it is defined in NFPA 3 in a specific way, and that's the way it needs to be applied. So I'm just going to kind of go over that for you guys so you understand sort of the nuances of how NFPA 3 defines commissioning. Here's the 4 learning objectives. I'm just going to go over them real quick because I kind of use them as an agenda for this presentation. We're going to talk about how NFPA 3 was developed and ultimately how it became a standard. And when I do that, I'll talk a little bit about what the difference is between, a standard, a best practice. We're going to talk about who's involved in fire protection and life safety system commissioning. We're going to recognize what types of projects might include this commissioning per NFPA 3. And then we're going to go over some of the common misconceptions that people have when applying NFPA 3. And a lot of the misconceptions that I'm going to talk about are a lot coming from sort of the fire protection side into the commissioning world. So I'm going to talk about some of the misconceptions that they've had, and because of all of these definitions and how they're defined, sort of how people perceive these different terms differently. So the first thing here is sort of one of the first things that I have to say to a person specifically when they're just doing sort of from the fire protection world into the commissioning world. A lot of people will hear use the term, oh yeah, well I tested that system, it's all commissioned, it's ready to go. And people don't realize that in NFPA 3, commissioning is that systematic process of documenting the design, the installation, and ultimately implementation, and then the maintenance of that system. So commissioning per NFPA 3 begins at the planning phase of the project, goes all the way through design, construction, and ultimately occupancy. So what types of systems am I talking about when I talk about fire protection and life safety systems? So a lot of people might just think of that and say, okay, well, what is that? Sprinkler system, fire alarm. There's a lot more to fire protection and life safety systems than just those sort of active systems. A lot of people don't think about things such as fire department access into the actual site where the building is and on the facility. So that's something that would be part of the commissioning. The access roads that might be coming from the means of egress out of the building, so the egress to the public way, that's something that would be part of a fire protection life safety system. You've got your public utilities, which are going to supply those fire protection systems, and then emergency power. We've got the fixed system, so that's your sprinkler system, maybe your kitchen hood system. Those are those more active fire protection systems that people think about. We've got your fire alarm system. One thing that a lot of you might be very familiar with, especially in HVAC, is the smoke control systems within buildings. We've got fire resistant and smoke resistant assemblies, so the actual walls, floors, and ceilings of a building, that's actually considered part of a fire protection and life safety system. Elevators, means of egress, stairs, doors. And then another thing, which is something we're seeing a lot more, is when you're starting to integrate systems, you've got things like access control on doors. So that's part of an egress system. If you've got automatic lighting, that could be considered part of your means of egress lighting. So that all gets tied into your fire protection and life safety systems. So it becomes a lot of systems, and today with buildings, as things are becoming more integrated, you're going to have to do a lot more testing from the fire protection and life safety standpoint to make sure that everything's working together. And that's why it's important why this commissioning process is done, to make sure that everything is working together. So when it came to developing this standard, the one thing that needed to be done was to first define what commissioning is. There's about 40 members on the technical committee. They're all volunteers that developed this standard. If you ask all 40 of them what the definition of commissioning is, you're going to get 40 different definitions of commissioning. So they all had to come to a consensus on how they're defining commissioning per fire protection and life safety systems per NFPA 3. So that definition is a systematic process that provides documented confirmation that building systems function according to their intended design criteria that's set forth in the building documents and satisfies the project owner's operational needs, and then also meets all of the applicable laws, regulations, codes, and standards. So commissioning is that systematic process of looking at all these systems, making sure they're doing what the codes are saying and the standards are saying they're supposed to be doing, and then also doing what the owner wants them to be doing within that building. And then also any other regulations or applicable laws that are within the jurisdiction that the building is being constructed or is already constructed. So some of the misconceptions that we get for commissioning of fire protection and life safety systems is like I talked about. A lot of people sort of use these terms interchangeably. The three terms being acceptance testing, commissioning, and integrated system testing. A lot of people tend to use them interchangeably when they're talking about things that are being done as far as testing and processes that are being followed. Acceptance testing is just testing that is done on a single system, on an individual system, to make sure that it's performing its intended function. So for example, if we take like a sprinkler system, say in this building, that system's got to be designed and installed per NFPA 13, which is the standard on the installation of a sprinkler system. NFPA 13 says that after you install that system, before you occupy the building, you need to perform a certain different types of acceptance testing to make sure that it has been installed correctly. Some of those acceptance testing are like hydro testing, which you increase the pressure to make sure there's no leaks. You do a main drain test to make sure you've got enough water coming to the fire protection system. Those are just making sure that the sprinkler system itself is installed correctly. It's not looking at any of the other systems sort of connected to it. As I talked about, commissioning is that the documented confirmation that's coming from NFPA 3. Right now, there are no codes or standards, at least within NFPA and IBC, that are requiring anyone to follow NFPA 3. So there's no buildings that are required to follow this commissioning process. Although now owners, insurance companies, depends, could require you to follow NFPA 3. There are some places in which you're going to have to follow certain portions of this, and I'll talk about that coming up. So the next part is integrated system testing. And integrated system testing is a test that's completed that's just looking at the operation, interaction, and coordination of your fire protection and life safety systems. So this is that test that people kind of think is already being done, although unfortunately in a lot of cases it's not. So in buildings today, we've got a lot of different systems that are connected to each other. So we'll use the example of the sprinkler system and the fire alarm system, and maybe the elevator recall. If you get a fire alarm, say the sprinkler system goes off, the water flow device opens, the test from NFPA 13 is not necessarily looking at whether or not signals are getting sent properly to the fire alarm panel. The acceptance test per NFPA 72 is not necessarily looking to make sure that the water flow device is sending the proper signal, or that the water flowing through the sprinkler system is going to operate the water flow device to send the proper signal to the fire alarm. A lot of cases, those are very simple systems, so those do get tested a lot, and for the most part, those are tested to make sure that they work properly. But systems such as like ANSEL, like the kitchen suppression systems, when someone goes in to do an acceptance test on that, they're just doing tests to make sure that that standalone system is going to work properly. If there's a fire in your kitchen hood, it's going to go off. Generally what happens is there's a relay from the fire alarm that's run to the kitchen hood, and then there's wires from the kitchen hood run to the relay. A lot of people, when they do that acceptance test, because it's not necessarily required, they're not making sure that the signal from the kitchen hood system is being sent to the fire alarm panel. So that's what this integrated system testing is looking at. It's looking at just the connection between integrated systems. And I'm going to talk about that a lot more in the next presentation coming up. But I did tell you guys that there are requirements in which you're going to need to follow parts of NFPA 3. One of the requirements in NFPA 3 is that you perform integrated system testing on all your fire protection and life safety systems, and you follow NFPA 4, which is the standard on integrated system testing of fire protection and life safety systems. Right now, the 2018 edition of the International Fire Code, the International Building Code, NFPA 1, the Fire Code, NFPA 101, the Life Safety Code, and NFPA 5000, the Building Code, all require you to perform integrated system testing on your fire protection and life safety systems per NFPA 4, provided you have a smoke control system in the building or you're a high-rise. Other than that, they require you to just perform integrated system testing, not necessarily per all the specific requirements in 4. And I'll talk about that a lot more coming up in the next hour. So, commissioning. I kind of hinted on this a little bit in the last slide about codes and standards and how they have specific scopes. So NFPA 13 covers the sprinkler system. That committee, the technical committee that develops that standard, only has the scope to provide requirements for the sprinkler system. Furthermore, the technical committee on NFPA 72, the fire alarm code, they only have the scope to provide requirements on the fire alarm panel, or the fire alarm system. Nowhere in the scopes of any of the specific design and installation standards for all of these systems is there something that allows the technical committee to provide requirements to make sure that everything's working together. And nowhere within any of the ITM standards, so the inspection, testing, and maintenance standards, building codes, or the fire prevention code, do they have the specific scope to tell you how to go in and test the integration of all those fire protection and life safety systems. So because of that, we needed a standard that allowed a technical committee to provide the requirements on how you're going to test all these systems together. And that is ultimately why NFPA 3, the standard on fire life safety commissioning, was created. So here's a quick outline. I'm just going to go through it just so you guys understand sort of what's included within this document. But as far as what I said, those 6 pages, chapters 1 through 6 are the 6 pages of actual enforceable requirements within the standard. So chapter 1 is your administrative type requirements. That's where the scope of the document and the scope of the technical committee is actually located. Reference publications, so a list of any of the standards that are referenced within the document are in chapter 2. All of the definitions that are used within the standard are found in chapter 3. Chapter 4 goes over any of the specific qualifications for the commissioning personnel on the commissioning team. I'm going to go over that coming up a little bit. 5 goes over the basic commissioning process that you need to follow. And then 6 goes over commissioning of existing systems. Then we've got some annex material. Annex A goes over any explanatory material on specific sections. There's annexes that goes over more specifically the qualifications of those teams. Another annex material on the responsibilities of each member. Some sample basis of design narrative reports, some sample commissioning documentation, and then some more informational references that are used within the annexes. So it's not a whole lot of information. If you go in there and you read it, it's not going to tell you, if you don't really know how to commission a building, it's not going to tell you necessarily how to do it. It's going to tell you what you need to do while you're doing it. And that's to allow it to be scalable and used on different types of projects and not to sort of pigeonhole it into only being used on specific projects that have specific types of systems. One thing I like to think is that just because you have these specific 3 systems, it's not going to ultimately tell you that you have to do these specific things. You're going to have to use your experience and knowledge to determine what type of testing is required. And that's what the team is going to be doing during that design and planning phase. And I'll talk about that coming up a little bit. So how many of you guys are familiar with the development process of a standard per NFPA or any other code development? So 1, 2, okay, 3. That's good. That's more than I was expecting. I didn't know a whole lot about it before I started working for NFPA. Just in the real quick brief explanation, because I think it's important that everybody know how these standards are developed. And I want everyone to know that you guys can all have a say in what goes into this document. There's nothing saying you can't tell the technical committee what they should consider putting into a document. So essentially what happens is, so for NFPA 3, the National Institute of Building Sciences came to NFPA and they submitted a project request. They said that we needed to have a document on the commissioning of fire protection and life safety systems. So that was in 2007. Essentially what happens is we get that project request. We then put that out for public comment. We put it out to the public. We say we want to create a standard on the commissioning of fire protection and life safety systems. We allow the public to provide comments on whether or not they think we should do that or not, or whether or not they think another standard already covers those requirements. So based on those public comments that we got, it was favorable. So we developed a technical committee of experts on the commissioning of fire protection and life safety systems. And they began to have meetings to start developing the draft of the standard. So what happens is a draft was developed in 2008, between 2007 and 2008. That's published out to the public to allow them to look at what's being proposed by the technical committee. Then they have a meeting. Back then it was called the ROP meeting. I'm not going to go into what it all stands for. Essentially it's their first draft meeting. So they're creating revisions on their draft that they've already created. So now it's becoming their first draft. They're essentially looking at public inputs that the public has looked at their draft and said, I think you should do this, I think you should do that, you need to change this, you need to consider doing whatever else. So they create changes and provide responses to the public. What actually happened is in 2009, they realized that they needed to be doing something a little bit different than just one single standard. They wanted to split the document. So they slipped cycle, which meant they went out of our normal timely cycle that we have to allow them more time to look into how they can split the document up to allow them to have another standard in addition to their standard on commissioning. So now they have their ROC meeting, which is their second draft after they've kind of figured out how they want to do this. And now they have, in 2011, they split the document. So essentially what they took is the document that is the standard on commissioning of fire protection and life safety systems, which used to have, as they were developing it, used to have a chapter on integrated system testing. Well, they slowly realized that that is becoming way more than half of the document. So they decided to split out the integrated system testing into its own document. So in 2011, that's when they started working on that. And in 2012, they published the first edition of NFPA 3. So NFPA 3, which is at the time of publishing, was just a best practice. Best practice meaning it's not enforceable, just a guide on how they think you should be doing commissioning of fire protection and life safety systems. So between 2012 and 2015, they had a whole new revision cycle where they revised NFPA 3 and they developed their first edition of NFPA 4. So in 2015, they published their second edition of NFPA 3, and then they published their first edition of NFPA 4, NFPA 4 being the standard on integrated system testing. And notice how I said standard. They didn't publish that as a best practice to begin with. They wanted it to be enforceable because they knew that that was something that had to be done. And that later set the stage for then the building codes and the fire codes to adopt it. That first edition of NFPA 4 is currently what's adopted by the building codes right now, the 2018 editions of the building code. Then after the next cycle of revisions, NFPA 3 became a standard. It's no longer a best practice. So if somebody wanted to adopt NFPA 3, say a jurisdiction wants to adopt NFPA 3, it is now enforceable and tells you what you have to be doing during your process. It's no longer a recommended practice. That's very important to this document. It holds a lot more weight being a standard than it would when it was a best practice. And just the important thing to note is throughout this whole process, I sort of noted that they went through a single revision process. And what that single revision process is the public provides inputs on changes that they want to be made. The technical committee looks at those inputs. They make changes. Then the public has the chance to comment on the changes that were made by the technical committee. And then the technical committee makes their changes based on the comments from the public. After that, essentially, the document then becomes a consensus standard and goes out to the street. But the big thing to note is that any of you guys, especially if you're involved in commissioning and you go through the document and you see something you don't like, you can say something to the technical committee. And you just go to nfpa.org, find the standard, you can submit public comments. And I'll talk about that coming up at the end a little bit. So I don't know if any of you guys have ever really seen this picture before. When I was first being sort of taught about the commissioning process coming from the fire protection side, I was shown this by someone sort of explaining why it's necessary to be doing this process. Something that I had never really necessarily thought about. Sort of showing you essentially what the actual, if you could look at it as saying, is what does the owner want, right? And then at the end, what they actually get. And that's because they're not necessarily that involved in the in the process, and kind of everyone decides what they think should be best for the project. So the big thing, the big question that is being answered during a commissioning process for fire protection and life safety systems is, did the owner get what the owner is paying for, right? The owner is essentially paying for systems that are going to first follow all of the required codes and standards, all the applicable codes and standards. They're all going to work together. That's important. And any other specific requirements that that building owner had. So those are the big things that need to be considered when you're doing this process. The main objectives of fire protection and life safety system commissioning is to document and communicate the owner's requirements, verify that all the systems are completed, inspected, tested, and approved, to perform that integrated system testing that I talked about, to document any deficiencies and any corrective actions that were made, and then to provide documentation and training to all the personnel that are responsible for maintaining all the systems. So what types of systems do you guys, or what types of buildings do you guys think are, is it most necessary to be doing commissioning on for fire protection and life safety? I hear hospital, which is important, right? But I also heard all. So a lot of people will think, yeah, bigger, more complex buildings require commissioning. Yes, they do, because they have a lot more systems. But the document is not written in a way in which it only works for those big, complex casinos, high-rise buildings, hospitals. You can be using this on the simplest buildings, and everybody in every building is afforded that same safety of the fire protection and life safety systems. Regardless of if you're going into a Dunkin' Donuts or you're going into a hospital, all of those fire protection and life safety systems should be installed, designed correctly, and they should all be working together, regardless of how many systems there are. So it's something that was designed to work on all different types of buildings. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the commissioning process in NFPA 3. I'd like to break it down into the people, the paper, and the process that's followed. So first, we'll talk quick about the fire protection and life safety commissioning team. A lot of these people are going to look fairly familiar to you guys within commissioning teams in general, right? There's a couple that the three in red I'll talk about a little bit more coming up, but I wanted to highlight two of them that I don't know if you guys may or may not necessarily work with as much during your projects. One of them being an insurance rep. Do a lot of you guys during a commissioning process work with an insurance rep? I see a couple head nods, but not a whole lot. So that's something, especially on bigger, more complex, more expensive buildings, you're going to see an insurance representative being involved, because a lot of insurance companies have their own specific requirements for what needs to be done. The insurance company has a bit of vested interest on how well the building performs to make sure that it doesn't injure anybody or burn to the ground or anything like that. And then the other one is the AHJ, or the authority having jurisdiction. So I know it's a pretty vague term, but it's essentially the person who's responsible for making sure that the building codes and standards are being utilized. So in the world of fire protection and life safety systems, that's going to be, could be the fire marshal, could be the building official. They're the person who's responsible for making sure that the fire protection and life safety systems are all following those codes and standards. So they're going to be doing your design review. They essentially will be giving you your permit. Especially as buildings get more and more complex, you're going to see that the authority having jurisdiction is going to be involved more and more, or you're going to want the authority having jurisdiction to be more involved because you don't want them throwing you a curveball at the end of the process saying that they want something else that you may have not considered already. So The three other people that are essentially new to the commissioning area, not necessarily the second one as much, but the first and the third being the commissioning agent, or the fire commissioning agent, and the integrated testing agent. So we'll talk about the fire commissioning agent, because that's the person who's essentially responsible for the commissioning of the fire protection and life safety systems. So the fire commissioning agent is a person or identity who's identified by the owner. That person is going to lead, plan, schedule, document, and coordinate the commissioning of the fire protection and life safety systems. I like to think of that person as sort of the quarterback of the fire protection commissioning team. They're making sure that everybody on the team is doing their job and everything's being done correctly. This person is a person who has a great understanding of the design, installation, and maintenance of these fire protection and life safety systems. So this person's going to need to have worked with them, been educated on them, know how they work, how they need to be interconnected, how they need to be designed. That's important because this person is responsible for creating the fire commissioning plan. They're responsible for implementing it and documenting it. And as part of that plan, they're responsible for making sure that the submittals coming from the contractors and everyone else on the team are meeting the requirements of the project. One of those requirements being that they're designed. So the fire commissioning agent at this time, per NFPA 3, there's no specific requirements say that they have to have a specific certification. They just need to meet those qualifications, essentially. Those qualifications which are judged essentially by the owner, the person who's hiring them, and the authority having jurisdiction. So the fire marshal or the person within the building department is responsible for making sure that that person is educated enough to perform the task. Will there possibly be a certification? It depends. If this is something that goes into the building code and is then required, you might see, in order to ease everyone with the process, it might become a certification. But one thing that you see a lot of people who perform this job are people such as fire protection engineers, because they have that broad knowledge of all the different types of systems. Maybe fire alarm contractors who've done a lot of work for a while and understand how everything works together. And then the one thing about a fire commissioning agent is that's noted within NFPA 3 is that that person has to be unbiased. So they can't have a joint interest in anything that's being done within the process. So they can't be financially tied to any of the specific team members. And one thing that I like to use as an example is if you had, say, like a general contractor, that person, once you start to get to the end of the construction phase and they just want to get their certificate of occupancy, they may start, cutting some corners. The fire commissioning agent is there to make sure that those corners don't get cut, that the installation of these systems is done per the standards. And that's why you want to have an unbiased person. Yep.
I didn't know you were going to take questions in the middle of your presentation, but because I was waiting on one that was really important to me.
Go for it. I'm here for you guys. I'd rather talk about what you guys want to talk about.
Definition of commissioning.
Yep.
You talk about making sure it's installed per blah, blah, per everything, and then you say per codes, per laws, and per stand-ups.
Yep.
Our experience has been that we commission these systems per the approved contract design documents, which has been reviewed by the authority having jurisdiction. We are not the authority having the jurisdiction. We shouldn't be taking on risks to basically, are you basically saying we should certify that the completed systems are installed per the laws, codes, and standards? Because that should be the requirement, in my opinion, of the designer that designed it and the contractor that built it. We assume that the contract documents we receive are designed per the applicable codes and we make sure that it functions that way, gets installed and functions that way. I don't see us as I don't know that we could get the insurance coverage from a liability standpoint to certify that something's installed per code.
Yeah, so the fire commissioning agent isn't necessarily that person who's all like stamping the document and saying that it's working properly, but they need to be reviewing it to make sure that essentially the designer isn't missing anything, right? The authority having jurisdiction should also be doing that plan review as well. But this is just another part of that step of someone who's got that holistic view of all these systems together to understand how they need to work together. It's not saying that you have to specifically say that all of these systems are designed exactly per these standards, but within your knowledge of how all these systems need to be working together, you need to make sure that it's meeting all those requirements. Yep. Go ahead.
So by that definition, would the licensed fire protection engineer who provide the design be a biased person to fill that role?
If they provided the design, then no, they can't be the fire commissioning agent because they have a bias. Their bias is that their design works.
But their responsibility is for the life safety and health, life safety and welfare of that building. So their liability is higher than this person's liability. How can you say that would be a biased person?
I mean, it all comes down, yeah.
For even after the commissioning is done, they're the people that are liable for that system working.
Again, it all comes down to what the authority having jurisdiction and the owner ends up saying that they want. The recommendation is that it's a person who's unbiased. That's the intent of what they're looking at. The biggest thing being monetarily biased or time crunched or things like that. Yeah.
So just to elaborate what he said, yeah, as a fire commissioning agent, if something I see that it doesn't meet the code, I just need to document and let them.
Document, send it back to the designer and say this isn't correct. Yeah. But if you, yeah, exactly.
So what happens when there's a gap between the interpretation of the code? If the designer interprets a certain way, which sometimes, the authority having jurisdiction, sometimes it doesn't line up, and here is another entity that's trying to make a judgment call on the codes and standards. So if there is some ramification, whatever, first part of the question is, who trumps these three different interpretations of the code? And if there is a liability associated with it, is CXA now required to carry that level of insurance to cover if there is something that needs to be enforced for their interpretation of the code?
So, per all documents, the authority having jurisdiction has the final say. That's like one of the first lines within all of the standards, that the authority having jurisdiction has the final say.
That has already happened. It's something is designed and it's already permitted, and we are in the commissioning stage process now. So that has already happened. Somebody has already said what's acceptable by the code, and that approves drawings. Now we're trying to kind of interpret it or verify it. So there is does that go back to the authority having jurisdiction?
Yeah, you'd have to, I mean, it's a constant conversation with them. It's not just, you don't just then make all your decisions in a vacuum after you've gotten their initial decision on something, because things will change, things become more clear and things like that. So again, that's why they're part of the team, and you need to be communicating with them.
Just as a passing comment, if you're hired by the owner, anybody, from the owner on down on the project, you're biased, because the owner's got a CFO, and if he doesn't make it, he's going to lose ass and interest or whatever else. We just open the door. Because I'm a PE, I don't care. You're going to lose $1,000 an hour, I get it. But I'm not going to sign off on this facility if I don't feel it's safe. Because I'm a PE. In the end, I said, and if you hold my money, you and I are going to have to go sideways about it. And it's a lot of money. I mean, I wasn't charging the guy a penny. I was charging him thousands of dollars. It was a big bill. I had a decent owner. But if I didn't, he'd say, screw you, I'm a billionaire, you're a contractor, I'll take care of the problem, and you're not going to get paid. Now, I can't undo that bias. That's one comment. Secondly, my lawyer will tell me you're never going to sign off on a code that says you're responsible for all laws, all codes, because you don't know what you don't know. Mm-hmm. And so there will be an exclusion in my report saying that I met the intent of the document, and except for the following. I don't know all laws, all codes, because I'm not going to set myself up for that lawyer that finds the one glitch when the damn thing burns to the ground and kills 100 people because there was something in some standard that got modified or a local ordinance changed it. Yeah. Or like he said, it was misinterpreted. So I'm just saying, I'm not trying to pick a fight with anybody, but you have set us up for Mission Impossible based on what's written so far. And let's keep going. I don't want to interrupt.
No, but I don't think, however it's read, I don't believe that the intent was that the fire commissioning agent, commissioning authority then all become responsible for making sure that every system was designed correctly. I'll have to look into it a little bit more to see if that was already written in there. But the other thing is that this document hasn't been out for that long. So I highly suggest that you guys submit public comment on it. These are the types of things that need to be sort of rectified in documents. But we can certainly talk about it more after.
I don't want to derail your train. I think you're doing a great job. Don't misunderstand.
No, but I agree with you that this hasn't necessarily been used a lot. Once it starts to get used a lot, people are going to start to pick up those things. And just like every standard, there's constantly changes. These are constantly things that need to be fixed.
I guess my one little question, as a commissioning, kind of by definition, we're the opinion people. We have never been the direction people. The authority having jurisdiction and the engineer of record are really the only two that can give direction. I mean, commissioning has always been opinion-based. So we're, like other gentlemen are saying, we're seeing that the intent is being there, but we have never been a certifier. We've always been just a witness and a conveyor of information. We kind of use an old analogy, you know, like we're Fox News, you know, we report, others decide, and that's kind of how we roll.
Yeah, no, that definitely makes sense, and that's definitely the intent of how that is that you're making sure it's being followed, but you're not, like if there's a problem, you're not solving it, right? You're sending it back to the designer to solve it, but you need to identify it.
But I always tell people in our deal, I'm not an acceptance authority. The DOJs and the DOR and the authority on jurisdiction, whatever that acronym is, they're the acceptance authorities. I'm not an acceptance authority. Mm-hmm. I'm here to make sure that the contract documents adhere to based on the content of the contract documents. If the contract documents don't call for it, the authority has jurisdiction, obviously a vote not me. Okay? But anyway, we're off in the weeds. Let's keep going.
No, I'm not surprised that this is where the conversation goes. I do a lot of work mostly with integrated testing, and that is like the #1 thing that comes up. Because everyone's upset that everyone's playing each other's sandbox and who's liable for things that are happening and not going correctly. So it's definitely a lot of things that have to be figured out by the team. And essentially the person being on top of that for commissioning would be the fire commissioning agent. Or the next thing would be the commissioning authority. And this is, I'm going to go through this kind of quickly. A lot of you probably are pretty familiar with the commissioning authority, but this shows how the fire protection and life safety system commissioning fits in with the whole building commissioning approach. So if you have a commissioning authority doing either a total building commissioning or partial building commissioning, that fire commissioning agent will report to the commissioning authority. On smaller projects, or it depends how things are organized, the commissioning authority, if they're experienced enough, can perform the jobs of the fire commissioning agent. So that's allowed. So the next person that is on that list, kind of that newer person that we talked about, is the integrated testing agent. So I told you guys that NFPA 3 requires you to follow NFPA 4 and do integrated testing on your fire protection and life safety systems. So in order to do that, you need to have an integrated testing agent. And that's the person sort of along the same lines of the fire commissioning agent, is the person who's going to plan, schedule, document, coordinate, and implement the integrated system test. And this is a person, they need to be experienced and have knowledge, sort of the same as the fire commissioning agent, in that installation, design, maintenance of those fire protection systems. They're going to have a little bit more knowledge on specifically how all the systems are interconnected and the best way to verify that they're connected correctly. That person's going to have a little bit more of that knowledge. The integrated testing agent is a person who's hired by the owner, and then they develop that integrated testing team that does all the testing on the different integrated systems. On smaller projects or differently organized projects, again, this document allows for you to kind of change the organization up. The fire commissioning agent can perform the duties of the integrated testing agent. The authority having jurisdiction, if they're educated enough and they want to do it, they can perform the task of the integrated testing agent. Kind of takes one person out of the line of sort of who has to approve it. But the authority having jurisdiction most likely is not going to have the time to do all this work. They'd much rather the owner hire someone to do it, and then they'll sort of review it. The other thing is that the owner themselves is allowed to perform the jobs of an integrated testing agent. That's more not necessarily along the lines of within a commissioning process, but if you're doing just standalone integrated testing, that allows the owner to sort of hire within or have their own people that can do the integrated testing. And I'm going to talk about that more sort of coming up in the next presentation. There's basically 4 big pieces of paper that I like to think about with this. We've got the basis of design, which you're going to take the owner's project requirements and you're going to create that narrative of how you're going to fulfill those requirements. You're going to explain the design theory of the different systems. A lot of the things that need to be included specifically within the basis of design is the building use group, so the occupancy classification, the area of the building, the number of floors, the area per floor, the height of the building, the type of construction, the hazardous locations within the building, the site access for emergency vehicles, and then your design description for all of your fire protection and life safety systems. So those are the things that have to be included within your basis of design. So then you have your commissioning plan that's developed by your fire commissioning agent, which identifies the process that's going to be followed to make sure that you're meeting that basis of design. It's going to have the milestones that are going to need to be met. It's going to have a lot of your, it's going to then essentially become your commissioning record once you're done with the process. So you're going to have developed your, making sure that you've done all the acceptance testing, any specific checklists that need to be done during construction, all that's going to be sort of put into that commissioning plan. Then you've got your construction documents. Those are all the documents that come in, and that needs to be looked at sort of by the fire commissioning agent and the authority having jurisdiction, and everybody on the team has to make sure that those systems are being designed per the applicable codes and standards. The applicable codes and standards are something that need to be put into the basis of design, because the applicable codes and standards in any jurisdiction is not necessarily just the newest code and standard. So you need to be putting anything that's applicable within the basis of design. And then next we've got the sequence of operations. I think most of you guys are pretty familiar with what a sequence of operations looks like. That's telling you how all the different systems are going to work together with each other. Again, I'm going to talk about that more with the integrated testing part. And then the documentation retention. These documents, the commissioning record needs to be maintained by the owner for the life of the building and for the life of whatever systems that were commissioned. Yeah. Yep. 3 things on the commissioning process. Just real quick, I sort of noted on this before. I'm running a little bit low on time, so I'm not going to go like specifically through each of the 4 phases. But commissioning follows that planning phase, design phase, construction phase, and occupancy phase. And then there's 2 other processes that are defined within the standard, one being recommissioning. So recommissioning, you guys are probably very familiar with this, but recommissioning is when you're commissioning a building that has already been commissioned and something is changed or something is wrong and you want to essentially do the commissioning process again on a building that's already been commissioned. So you'll see this happen a lot when you have an owner change, maybe when you change the occupancy type of a building, you change the use of a building, you'll want to look at recommissioning a building. And then this could be full or partial. You could do some of the systems, you could do all of the systems. And another thing is, like I said, if systems aren't performing as intended, maybe you have a smoke control system that is not necessarily working as it's needed. One of the things to possibly look into finding the issues within the building or within that system itself would be to recommission the smoke control system. And then the last process is retrocommissioning. So that's commissioning of fire protection and life safety systems that have not been commissioned through the NFPA 3 process. So it's going to require a lot of work to look into what was the design intent of the time of those systems were put in, what are the current operational needs, and then verifying the performance and verifying that it meets those needs and that design intent. So I talked about the future of NFPA 3. Or I talked about the process and sort of how it's created. Right now, they have created their first draft for the next edition, which is going to be the 2021. It's in the A20 revision cycle, but it's always a year ahead of that. So right now, it's open until May 8th for you guys to go in and provide any comments that you have on changes that they've made. So I highly suggest if you guys look through the document and there's things that you don't necessarily like, provide them with input on these things. They're constantly looking for, you know, another set of eyes to look at these to make sure that either they're not missing anything or like things like you were talking about with sort of who's responsible for what and things like that and how things are specifically written. So you have until May 8th to go in to do that. If you guys want to know specifically how to do it, come talk to me. I have no problem helping you guys. And then a little bit on some of the resources that we provide at NFPA. I talked about integrated system testing, that being one of the parts of the commissioning of fire protection and life safety systems. We do offer a one-day workshop on sort of how to do the integrated system testing on fire protection and life safety systems. We'll go over all the nuances and things like that. The next class that we have is actually, it's not on here because we added it after I made this presentation, but it'll be June 15th. In San Antonio, actually right before our NFPA's conference and expo. It'll be the Saturday before that. And then we have another class in Tarrytown, New York, May 23rd. So if you guys are interested, you can go to our website, nfpa.org/4, if you want to look at the integrated system stuff. And then again, if you have more questions on NFPA 3 and you want to learn a little bit more on the intent of the technical committee and sort of the things that they were thinking about when they were developing it, I highly suggest you guys taking a look at, we have a handbook on NFPA 3, and it's got a lot of expert commentary on the specific requirements and the intent of those requirements, so that you can find at nfpa.org as well. So that's all I have for now. Do you guys have any more questions? I know I answered a lot during, but.
Can the integrated agent be the contractor?
There's nothing that says like the general contractor or something like that can't be the integrated testing agent. No, it could be. And sometimes you'll see the integrated testing agent be the fire alarm contractor because a lot of things are integrated through the fire alarm. Any other questions? All right. Oh, go ahead.
When you said unbiased, so if the fire protection commissioning agent work for the same company but not part of the design, can it be unbiased?
It all depends on how it's documented and who approves it being. So when you develop the team, the authority having jurisdiction is going to look at it. And this is all coming from the assumption that NFPA 3 becomes adopted and required, right? If it becomes adopted and required, say it's through the fire marshal, and the fire marshal becomes the authority having jurisdiction, they're the person who's going to tell you how you're applying this code, right? So if you say that I want to have everybody in one company be every team member, they're going to say no, or they're going to say yes. It all depends on whether or not they approve how you document how things are being done. But again, it all comes down to the authority having jurisdiction for things like that. All right, good, thanks.